What's up, you team of bad savages? My name is Tom, and today I'm gonna react US Special Forces vs Wagner Group Battle of Kasham. So let's dive in.
500 pro-Syrian government troops led by a detachment of Wagner PMC fighters versus 40 American Special Forces and a handful of their Syrian rebel allies. But not only was no American even wounded, the opposing force was utterly devastated, and we have Russia to thank? The conflict in Syria has been raging for years, with the United States of America and the Russian Federation both supporting opposing sides. The US and its coalition partners support the Syrian Democratic Forces, a group of rebels from varying groups who all have one goal: overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad and bring him to justice for his many crimes against humanity. The Russian Federation naturally supports Assad's dictatorship, if for nothing else than because Assad has made it clear that the Russian Navy will maintain access to the Mediterranean.
Listen, guys, this is so terrible to live in a country where where war is happening. This is like, man, and you know, like big countries are dealing the influence between each other, and just normal people like you and I are suffering because of that. Man, this is so sad.
The least naval facilities on Syria's coast. The opportunity to commit wanton war crimes is just a plus for Russian troops. Both sides have been careful to steer clear of each other's military forces. When Syrian Democratic Forces captured Raqqa from ISIL in 2017, the Euphrates River became a de facto border between US-backed rebels and the Russian-backed Syrian government. A deconfliction line was set up between US and Russia to ensure that neither side accidentally engaged each other's forces, especially vital due to heavy presence of air power on the US side and ground-based air defenses on the Russian side. While the Russian Aerospace Forces provide air support, Russia's main tool on the ground is the Wagner Group, the now infamous shadowy PMC, which acts like an extension of the Russian government.
And also Wagner Group, who made a coup last summer, which failed, of course, because they stopped, 200 kilometers before Moscow, man. That was mad time. I remember, like, literally Latvia has a border with Russia, right? And when the Wagner coup happened last year, man, I didn't even know what to think, because I thought it's gonna be a civil war over there, because this is crazy, man. And I got really depressed because of that, but thank God, or I don't know, like, it didn't happen, you know, so.
At least it used to in the good old days before Prigozhin tried to march on Moscow before changing his mind. Back then, at least, Wagner acted in unison with the Russian government's wishes, giving the Kremlin plausible deniability as its operatives inflicted mayhem across the Middle East and Africa. The Euphrates had served as a tentative border between pro-government and rebel forces, but the Syrian government had managed to secure a small salient across the river. The US and Russia both agreed that no more than 400 troops could be stationed in that salient at any one time, and while Syria nor Iranian-backed militias were party to this agreement, the Syrian government needed Russian support bad enough to agree to those terms by proxy. The troop limit was meant to prevent a sudden offensive by pro-government forces, which otherwise would have to cross the river, giving rebel forces ample time to mount a defense. Details of what happened next remain murky, but a narrative can be pieced together from various sources, while disregarding the more outlandish claims out there. What we do know is the rebel forces held very profitable oil facilities near the Euphrates, and in past conflicts, Wagner PMC has often been compensated by being granted a share in liberated, a term we use extremely loosely here, mining and oil extracting or processing facilities. Several days before the infamous attack, US intelligence intercepted communications between Wagner's chief Yevgeny Prigozhin and senior Syrian officials as well as Kremlin officials. The intercepted communications painted a picture of the Kremlin and the Syrian government giving Prigozhin the green light to go ahead with a, quote, fast and strong operation sometime in early February. The only problem for both the Syrian government and Prigozhin's ambitions was a detachment of US Special Forces based near the lucrative oil facilities that Prigozhin hoped to seize. Wagner nor the Russian government could launch an all-out attack that couldn't.
Listen, guys, Prigozhin, the guy who was the head of Wagner Group, he was a greedy, terrible person, man. And you know, because I know, as I said, I know Russian language, and I watched a lot of materials about him. He was very close to Putin from one time. By the way, in 90s, he was just an ordinary nobody, basically. But thanks to Perestroika, thanks to that many criminals were able to seize power in 90s, he got to power, and then he became the chief of Putin, like the chief who prepares the food because he had the restaurants, right? So it goes very deep.
To be traced directly back to them, so days before the battle, U.S. intelligence began to note the arrival of dozens of fighters just across the Euphrates. U.S. officials quickly notified their Russian counterparts about this massing of troops, but the Russians claimed they had no control over local fighters. This would fly in the face of intercepted radio communications in Russian coming from the massing troops. Officially, the Russians claimed that the gathering force were Syrian government soldiers and members of various militias fighting on their own initiative. However, U.S. intelligence was extremely confident that a significant number of the fighters assembling in the area were Wagner military contractors. As the force began to move out at around 3 p.m. local time, it was clear it was making its way to a Conoco gas plant near the city of Deir al-Zur. Right in the force's way was a headquarters manned by between 30 to 40 U.S. Delta Force soldiers and rangers, alongside a few Kurdish and Arab allies. If the Wagner-led force was going to capture the Conoco plant, it would have to go straight through the Americans. Watching via drone feeds, the tiny American-led force was not just outnumbered 10 to 1, but the Syrian force were advancing with 27 armored vehicles, including several tanks. U.S. forces on the ground had nothing that could stop a tank. About 20 miles away, Green Berets and a platoon of Marine infantry also watched the advancing force via drone feed, waiting for the call to roll out. They were equipped with Stryker armored vehicles, but could bring man-portable weapons to bear on the Syrian tanks. Even if the Marines and Green Berets got there in time, they would still be significantly outnumbered and outgunned in raw firepower. Also monitoring the situation was the American Air Operations Center at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, which immediately placed all available air assets on alert. Nobody could be sure the Wagner-led Syrian force was truly aiming for a fight. It wouldn't be the first time that they'd attempted to intimidate the US or its allies into concessions. However, the previously intercepted communications made the Americans wary that this was the big move Prigozhin had been asking for permission to make, and the formation's movement toward the Conoco plant seemed to back the suspicion up. As evening began to fall, it was clear that the Syrian formation was making its move. At the mission support site 20 miles away from the U.S. Delta Force and the Rangers, Marines scrambled into 4 Strykers to be ready to provide support if needed. They were still only 16 strong, but the Strykers could deliver a world of pain on their own with great precision. Their equipment was far superior to anything the Syrians or even Wagner forces had on hand, with extra Javelin anti-tank missiles tossed into the vehicles alongside thermal optics and extra food and water.
Man, I'm not messing with the US forces, man. I just don't understand how brave or dumb you need to be to mess with US forces. Because I have documentaries about how developed is US Army, guys. And just for people who don't know, US budget spending for army has, first of all, is the highest in the world. And many leading countries combined in the world, many leading world countries that have big armies, their combined budgets are barely reaching the top of USA budget, if you know what I mean.
Everyone involved expected a significant and protracted battle to come, but the order to move out hadn't been issued yet. At 8:30 p.m., the spearhead of the enemy formation had made it to a mile from the plant. Led by 3 T-72 tanks, the U.S. forces at the Conoco plant had nothing to match that level of firepower, but the tanks had stopped, and there was hope that the ensuing battle could be averted. Secretly, though, more tanks and vehicles gathered in nearby neighborhoods, using the buildings as cover to remain unseen. U.S. drones, though, watched their every move. Even so, the quick reaction force of Marines had not been dispatched, the Pentagon hoping that a conflict could be avoided. Then suddenly, all hell broke loose. Long-range artillery began to open up on the American position, supplemented by much closer mortars. The T-72s also opened up with their main guns, while armored vehicles strafed with their cannons and heavy machine guns. The fire was largely inaccurate, but dangerous in volume. U.S. forces and their partners ran for cover behind dirt berms, preparing to use their small store of anti-tank missiles on the advancing vehicles. However, the U.S. still attempted to avoid an all-out confrontation. Very confident Russian Wagner mercenaries were amongst enemy troops. The last thing the Trump administration wanted was an accidental war with Russia. For 15 minutes after the attack began, U.S. officials repeatedly called their Russian counterparts, asking them to recall the attacking force. However, Russian officials repeatedly denied knowledge of the attack, claiming that the gathered forces were Syrian volunteers and government troops that they had no control over. The Quick Reaction Force was already on its way though, but driving on very rough roads and with their headlights off to avoid being targeted. Instead, they relied on night vision and thermal cameras, making an already slow drive even slower. With U.S. troops under fire and the Russians refusing to cease the attack, Secretary of Defense Jim Mathis turned to General Joseph F. Dunford Jr., chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Deep inside the belly of the Pentagon, they watched via live drone feeds the advancing force.
Sorry guys, I think I already reacted to this documentary, but by another author. But in the same time, it's very interesting to see will this author be able to highlight maybe even more from this conflict. So yeah.
Who were now starting to become dangerously accurate with their fire as they drew closer. Secretary of Defense Mathis then gave a simple command: annihilate them. Within seconds, the Secretary of Defense's order had reached American commanders in the region. At the Conoco plant, the Rangers and Green Berets had already expended their small supply of anti-tank weapons. This had knocked several of the armored vehicles out of the fight, but just under 24 more continued to advance, albeit a hell of a lot more cautiously now. The Russians had gotten their first taste of the Javelin, before being served a 3-course meal in Ukraine years later. But U.S. forces were entirely outmanned, and enemy artillery was making it difficult to engage approaching troops. Within minutes of General Mattis's order, the U.S. Air Force began to bring the pain. First to strike were armed drones, the same ones currently overwatching the conflict, but these drones had very limited munitions and could do little to impact the fighting on the ground. Additional Reaper drones began to arrive, carrying out precision strikes against enemy artillery and mortar positions. Next came the waves of American fighters. F-22 Raptors had already been sent near the fighting. Russian air defenses extended well over this part of Syria, and the U.S. could not know how Russia would react once it began to launch a full-scale air operation. The Raptors therefore had been sent to ensure Russian fighters did not interfere, but with none on the horizon, they were turned loose on the ground forces below. F-15 Strike Eagles were hot on their heels, delivering punishing precision strikes against artillery and mortar positions. At around 11:30 p.m., the Quick Reaction Force of Marines had reached the fighting, but forced to hang back due to the heavy artillery. Their own vehicles would be made mincemeat by the enemy tanks, and the heavy...
I mean, I cannot imagine the level of adrenaline that is happening on the battlefield, because you're like between life and death, and any mistake, you're just dead straight away. Man, this is so scary to think about.
Heavier infantry fighting vehicles, so the Marines were forced to sit back and wait, but they wouldn't have to wait long. Marine rocket artillery based dozens of miles away had been feeding precision rockets into the fight with the aid of drones, striking at enemy artillery. Not long after, a flight of Apache helicopters came screaming out of the horizon, delivering a withering barrage of missiles and rockets to the advancing tanks and armored vehicles. A Russian survivor would later describe the American Apaches as whirling carousels of heavy machine gun and cannon fire as the armored helicopters strafed across the advancing enemy at treetop height, wary of man-portable air defense weapons. High above them, though, the Air Force had finally brought out the big guns, the B-52 strategic bombers. These lumbering arsenal ships had taken longer to get to the fight than the much nimbler strike aircraft, but they disgorged earth-shattering amounts of firepower on the enemy below. The enemy artillery and mortar positions were of highest priority, as they were preventing the QRF from reaching the beleaguered Rangers and Delta Force operatives. With the artillery destroyed, the QRF finally made it to the besieged American defenders, providing some much-needed relief, even if they were still woefully outnumbered. U.S. planes low on fuel or out of ordnance had by now been forced to turn back, opening up a brief window for the Wagner-led attack. Many of the enemy had abandoned their vehicles by now more a liability than a protection, and advanced on foot. The newly arrived Marines fed fresh ammo to the defenders, who by now were nearly out of everything, down to just a few magazines of rifle ammunition. Machine guns and javelins opened up once more, unleashing hell on the advancing troops. From inside their striker vehicles, Marines operated the remote weapon stations, their thermal sensors making it impossible for the enemy to hide in the dark. An AC-130 gunship arrived in the sky overhead, opening up with its howitzer and cannons. Air Force combat controllers began to direct the next wave of American strike aircraft, which had been quickly refueled and rearmed, their weary pilots refusing to be replaced as long as U.S. troops were still under fire. Everything American that could fly in the region was put into the air, the defenders still being massively outnumbered and overmatched in firepower. Every single flight of strike aircraft and attack helicopter was like a flight of guardian angels, delivering righteous fury in the form of precision high explosives and armor-piercing cannon fire. An hour later, the ill-fated attack finally halted. Enemy troops began a hasty withdrawal. In a show of good faith, the U.S. Air Force ceased atomizing the retreating troops. Some were allowed to return to collect their dead. The 500-strong force had been shattered, and the only casualty on the U.S. side was an allied Syrian fighter who had been lightly wounded. So, what really happened and who was in charge, and how was Russia responsible for this overwhelming U.S. victory? Even years after the incident, there remained significant gaps in the public knowledge over the event. Russia denied all responsibility, claimed that no Wagner forces had been involved in or had knowledge of the attack.
Yeah, of course. What can else they say, you know? Like, of course they will deny everything, man. They're washing their hands, you know?
This was in direct opposition to released U.S. surveillance footage which showed an airstrike on a Wagner artillery position directly supporting the attack. In the months to come, independent journalists inside Russia confirmed that an unusually high number of dead Wagner troops arrived in Russia after the battle. These journalists also confirmed a large number of Wagner mercenaries flown to Russian hospitals in the days after the battle. However, officially the Russian government stated that only 4 Russian volunteers had died in the attack, though later the Syrian and Russian government would say that it's possible dozens were killed or injured. German publication Der Spiegel would conduct an investigation and allege that no Russians were involved in the fighting. Other sources inside Russia made incredible claims of 200 Wagnerites being killed. A Russian investigative group, Conflict Intelligence Team, would do its own investigation and estimate that as many as 30 Russians died in the fighting. In 2023, The Gray Zone, a Telegram channel often associated with Wagner, published a summary of the infamous battle. From interviews with Wagner soldiers present, U.S. forces first used Reaper drones to take out the lead and rear vehicles of the formation in a classic ambush. Then Apache helicopters came roaring into the confused mess, decimating anyone attempting to retreat. A loitering AC-130 gunship pounded defensive positions into dust even as men attempted to find cover in nearby buildings. F-16s hounded them from above, with one Wagnerite allegedly claiming that in the morning the area was littered with liquefied gun barrels and solidified sand, melted in the intense heat of the American attack and re-solidifying after. The Gray Zone would publish accounts from Wagnerites who rallied against the Russian Air Force, which had jets stationed nearby but did not move to aid them. Allegedly, some pilots asked for permission to respond but were refused. With loitering F-22s and F-15s, it was definitely the right call.
Man, as I said, this is so scary. Imagine like everything flying towards you. Imagine all these planes, just all this gun power, and it's going for you, man. And then they're trying to kill you, man. This is so scary. I like. Why do they do it? Why do those guys go to war? I don't know. You know. So this is why not live life? Why not enjoy life? Why you have to go kill somebody?
The Gray Zone would also claim that Wagner casualties were very high, but far less than the 600 or 200 that other outlets were reporting. We'll probably never know how many Wagnerites or even Russian special forces were directly involved in the fighting, but it's clear that the attack was led by Wagner and Yevgeny Prigozhin, who wanted to seize the Conoco oil field at all costs. However, in a surprising twist, and perhaps one that cemented in Prigozhin's mind the fact that he could no longer trust Putin's government, it was the Russian military itself which ensured the attack would ultimately fail.
Talking about Prigozhin, guys, for people who don't know, he got killed, and it happened, basically his plane blew up, because after the coup that he made, like they stopped 200 kilometers before Moscow, and they went to Belarus, the Wagner group, and then they forgave Prigozhin, right? Putin forgave Prigozhin, and then just like, unfortunately, Prigozhin died in a plane crash. The plane like blew up in the sky, you know. And the guy, I think he had ambitions to become the new leader of Russia.
Russian air defenses were dense in the region and posed a significant challenge for U.S. aircraft. In the years since, the world would learn that despite Russia refusing to recall the attack, they had ordered their air defenses to stand down, giving the green light to the U.S. to use its air power freely. Why this is remains unknown. Perhaps Russia wished to continue its guise of plausible deniability. Wagner is a Russian PMC that works directly in the interest of the Russian government, but as a PMC, it affords Russia the option to disown or disenfranchise itself from any of the group's actions. Turning off the air defenses might have been Russia playing to this plausible deniability. After all, keeping the air defenses on would have essentially married the Russian government to the attack on the Conoco oil field. That would have come with significant consequences, inevitably sparking a significant buildup of U.S. forces in the region and dramatically escalating the possibility of all-out conflict between the two sides. It's also possible that Russia simply significantly underestimated U.S. air power. Air operations are difficult, a carefully choreographed dance of logistics, platforms, and personnel. As the Ukraine war has proven, Russia itself is incapable of coordinating significant air operations, let alone a massive and rapid, extremely time-sensitive response. The Russians might have assumed the U.S. shared this weakness, or that it simply couldn't coordinate so many different platforms so quickly. The Russians bet wrong. The U.S. air operation in the Battle of Kasham is nothing short of a military miracle. No matter which way you stack it, even with significant air support, U.S. forces should have been easily overrun. But the U.S. absolutely annihilates its own budget to find extremely terrifying capabilities you literally never want to be on the wrong end of. Firstly, the U.S. air fleet has the largest capability for close air support of any air fleet in the world. While Russian aerospace forces struggle to deliver accurate ground support, there's hardly any U.S. air combat platform that is incapable of doing the job that Russian planes simply aren't equipped for, and they're
Also, USA has a indestructible navy, unreal ground forces, man. I'm not messing with USA. At least I won't do that because I'm not dumb.
pilots aren't trained for. The ability for U.S. warplanes from an F-15 to a B-52 to deliver precision ground fire is unmatched by any other nation in the world, and it's basically illegal for any U.S. aircraft of any kind to take to the skies without the ability to drop a bomb with high precision right where the troops need it the most. But U.S. logistics and command and control is the secret hero of the show here, because Russia likely did not expect such a massive and well-coordinated response of so many different air platforms. The U.S. threw literally everything, including the kitchen sink, into the sky that day, knowing that its ground forces were hopelessly outmatched. But such massive air operations require significant command and control expertise and resources, especially to deconflict targets, ensuring that one attack wave isn't simply hitting the exact same already destroyed targets that the last wave did. This is a significant problem for Russian aerospace forces in Ukraine. Russia's problems don't just end there, because the nation is incapable of deconflicting its airspace as well. Hilariously, Russian air defenses in Ukraine are in an intense race with Ukrainian air defenses for the highest number of downed Russian aircraft. That's because Russia lacks the expertise and systems to effectively manage large air operations alongside ground air defenses. It's unlikely then that Russia could have foreseen the expert ballet of command and control that saw U.S. air power hammer attacking forces nearly non-stop for 5 hours. The Battle of Kasham was, well, embarrassing for the Syrian government and for Wagner. But it was also a warning to the rest of the world. If you pick a fight with the US, you absolutely, positively, definitely cannot allow US air power to enter the picture.